after September 11th, in a world in which we as a nation have lost our way, somebody ought to stand up. Peter stood up in those days, and Martin Luther King Jr. stood up in those days. But somebody ought to stand up in these days. Somebody ought to stand up and say that violence is wrong. It's wrong when it's perpetrated by Al-Qaeda, and it's wrong when it's perpetrated by us. Somebody ought to stand up and say that hatred and bigotry is wrong. Islamic bigotry and hatred is wrong. Christian bigotry and hatred is wrong. Out of one blood, God has made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth. Somebody ought to stand up for peace and say that the best route to homeland security is to attack worldwide poverty. We cannot shoot our way or bomb our way out of this. We need less bombs and more bread. Bread will not always turn an enemy into a friend, but bombs breed more terrorists than they can destroy. And so you ought to empower the poor and embrace the peace. I'm so glad that Peter stood up. And in these days, somebody ought to stand up and tell America that we cannot continue to be prosperous while continuing to broaden the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Somebody ought to stand up and say that it's not just a moral question, it is that, but it is also a practical question. You can't keep on ripping and stripping the poor of their basic needs and expect to have a prosperous nation. You can't have young black boys drop out of high school and expect to have a prosperous nation. Somebody ought to stand up